corruption, and the cover-up. But now we know that he cannot protect our people or our country. We just received these documents that Trudeau has been covering up for years. Documents related to a massive security breach at the Trudeau government's most sensitive laboratory, where the most dangerous viruses and pathogens are studied and handled. We have learned that the Trudeau government's head of pathogens was collaborating with members of Beijing's People's Liberation Army who are responsible for bioweapons and bioterrorism. We know now that a People's Liberation Army official was able to gain personal access, walk in the door, look at computers, and have access to all of our most important virological secrets.
And Dr. Masai Kitano takes over. Under him, Unit 732 works on plans to launch biological attacks on the Americans with plague or anthrax-carrying balloons. Ultimately, all plans to attack U.S. forces with such methods were halted by Tojo in fear of retaliation.
Trudeau, what did he do when he found out about this? Did he immediately inform Canadians of the breach? Did he fire anybody? No, no one was fired. Did he call an inquiry to get to the bottom of it? No, he didn't do that either. Instead, he covered it all up. He defied 4 parliamentary orders to release these documents. When the Speaker tried to get them, he sued the Speaker to cover this up. He said it was all for national security, but well, we know from a committee composed of 4 members of Parliament, including 1 Liberal, and 3 judges, and I quote, the information appears to be mostly about protecting the organization from embarrassment for failures in policy and implementation, not legitimate national security concerns, and its release is essential to hold the government to account. In other words, there was no national security reason why we couldn't have had this before. It was only because Trudeau didn't want the embarrassment before an election. So what did he do then? He collaborated, knowing this, he collaborated with Beijing to buy a vaccine for COVID. Could you imagine if the deal that Trudeau wanted to sign with Beijing had gone ahead and we had procured China-made vaccines after learning this information? That's what was in this guy's head. And if you think for a minute, because I know there'll be all kinds of excuses, well, he's not responsible and how could he possibly take ownership of what happens in his government. Let me quote him. He has a document called Open and Accountable Government. And I quote, "As head of government, the Prime Minister has special responsibilities for national security." End quote. It's his responsibility. This is his government's lab. It's not a random university lab. It's the top lab for the Prime Minister's public health agency. And he is exclusively responsible for the machinery of government as Prime Minister of the country. So this is on Justin Trudeau. I will add one last thing. Not only did he cover it up, not only did he try to get a vaccine from China after knowing this, he called a snap election to make sure that the voting would happen before this came out. And what happened in that election? Beijing interfered to help him win it. This is a man who says he admires China's basic communist dictatorship. We cannot trust Justin Trudeau to keep our people and its country safe. We need a strong, conservative, common-sense government that will root out foreign interference, protect our critical secrets and our medical research, and stand on guard for our country to keep our people and our nation safe.
There were Canadian and American fighter jets scrambled to intercept the object and to take it down. It was very much based on the context and the situations of who was there, who had the capacity to do it before we lost the object into darkness or into situations. Our focus was not on which side gets credit for what. Our focus was on running the operation smoothly and successfully. That's what NORAD is all about, and that's a perfect example of how seamlessly we work together. A Liberal government will also do what the Harper Conservatives ought to have said years ago. We will not by the F-35 fighter jet. Instead, we will launch an open and transparent competition to replace the CF-18s, keeping in mind the primary mission of our fighter aircraft is the defense of North America. This process will also ensure that bids include guaranteed industrial benefits for Canadian companies and workers. Because the Conservatives' sole-sourced plan for the F-35 did not. See, by choosing to replace the existing CF-18s with a more affordable aircraft than the F-35, we will be able to guarantee the delivery of current procurements for the Navy.
Meantime, there are questions about why Canada didn't shoot down a suspected Chinese spy balloon before the U.S. did. Officials say the balloon crossed into Canadian airspace January 30th and traveled over the Northwest Territories, Alberta and Saskatchewan before re-entering the U.S.
Yesterday, NORAD confirmed that an unidentified object entered unlawfully Canadian airspace. It represented a reasonable threat to civilian aircraft. So I gave the order to take it down.
You may remember that our Prime Minister last weekend boasted on Twitter that he had ordered the takedown of an unidentified object over Canadian airspace. Probably not. It was American pilots and American jets from an American base that shot down an object that had inconveniently floated over Canada. But they detected it on their American air defense radar, and probably because we're in a North American air defense treaty with the Americans, somebody thought they should call Trudeau and see if it was okay if they blasted the thing out of the air.
We are deploying all measures possible to keep Canadians safe. We understand that Yukoners, and I spoke with the Indigenous leaders, the First Nations leaders in the affected territory last night, are rightly concerned about the impact on their citizens.
Canada's aging fleet of CF-18 fighter jets likely would have had trouble reaching the balloon. It reportedly had an altitude of 60,000 feet, while the CF-18s have a ceiling of about 50,000. The U.S. F-22 that shot it down can reach heights of 65,000 feet.
It's taken us years to buy new jets for jets that were ordered when Atari and Pong were the height of gaming technology. That's how old our CF-18s are. Our tanks are in such disrepair that when the Ukrainians came looking for a few to help them defend themselves against the Russians, out of the 100 that we technically own, we could only cobble together 4 that would function by cannibalizing the other ones for spare parts. We sent a group to Latvia without helmets. They had to buy their own helmets. But it goes way beyond that. We sent a unit to Poland last year, but didn't send any cooks. Told all of the soldiers, we'll buy your meals locally at restaurants and we'll reimburse you. But it took months for the reimbursement checks to come, so long that a lot of the people on deployment in Poland relied on people back home, family, friends, relatives, to pay off their credit card bills. This is what happens when you have a government that has no respect for the military.
The decision was taken to take this down over fairly unpopulated and sparsely populated territory to make sure that the safety of Canadians and of Yukoners was first and foremost. In the recovery efforts, a lot of it is going to be around searching for and hopefully finding the object, but there are also places and teams in place to make sure that whether it's hazardous, whether there's who knows what associated with the object, it be properly dealt with by people with the proper training to make sure that there is no risk to human life.
And you want another example? Look at the Turkey-Syria earthquake and the recovery efforts. We have a fantastic emergency response team. It's called DART, Disaster Assistance Response Team. It has medical and engineering expertise. It has field hospitals, instant bridges. It has all sorts of equipment that can be taken into a disaster area and very quickly get medical attention to the people who are in need and help the countries rebuild their infrastructure, their power, their roads, their buildings. The Liberals won't send it. And indeed, since 2015, for more than 7 years since the Liberals have been our government, they have never once deployed DART.
I'm just asking, I know the recovery effort is ongoing, but NORAD told the Associated Press this weekend that they have an idea of what this aircraft is. Is there any reason we don't have more information on what this aircraft is?
Our focus right now is on recovering it. Obviously, there is much analysis going on at the highest levels of NORAD in both Canada and the United States to try and understand more, to facilitate in the location of the object and to understand better and be able to answer the questions that Canadians have. And as soon as we have more clarity and better answers to give to Canadians, we will be giving them.
Japanese paper balloons, identified by the code name Paper.
In World War II, the Japanese were looking at a way to strike North America, both Canada and the United States, remotely. So what they did is they designed balloons.
The Japanese had determined before the war that there were high-level winds passed over the Japanese main islands and down through the coast of western North America, and it was their intent to send these balloons across the Pacific Ocean in these high-level, high-speed winds.
At about 30,000 feet, under prevailing wind conditions reaching velocities of about 100 miles per hour, it takes approximately 4 days to make the crossing during the winter months, when wind velocities are highest. These units have been found in areas ranging from Alaska all the way south to the Mexican border.
Dana Hatherley, Yukon News. Which communities in the Yukon can expect authorities to be dealing with debris, and what can communities expect?
We are searching what is a fairly large area that is roughly put between Dawson and Mayo, I believe, is in the area. We are obviously sending a lot of Canadian Armed Forces and RCMP resources to lead on the search in the coming days. But as time goes on, we will for sure have different instructions to give to local outfitters and trappers and people who may be in the area. For now, however, it really needs to be the Canadian Armed Forces leading the recovery efforts, because we, as I've said, we don't know the degree of hazard that could be involved in this object that was downed, and we have to be safe.
Over the course of 6 months between November 1944 and April 1945, Japan launched over 9,300 fire balloons. The balloons were released from the Japanese island of Honshu, and one or more eventually found their way to the states of Alaska, Washington, Oregon, California, Arizona, Nevada, Idaho, Montana, Utah, Wyoming, Colorado, Texas, Kansas, Nebraska, South Dakota, North Dakota, Michigan, and Iowa, as well as British Columbia, Saskatchewan, Manitoba, Alberta, the Yukon, and the Northwest Territories in Canada. Some even reached northern Mexico. 361 of the balloons have been confirmed to have made it to North America. Fighter pilots from the United States and Canada attempted to intercept a number of the balloons, but had little success because of how high and fast the balloons traveled. Fighters destroyed fewer than 20 of the balloons. Sightings of the balloons and explosions from their bombs were witnessed across the aforementioned states and provinces. Several more were found in the ocean before arriving to the continent. A number of fires were started by the balloons, and remains of them were found in the streets of Los Angeles and on the outskirts of Detroit. One balloon even caused a short circuit in the power lines for a nuclear reactor that was part of the Manhattan Project. A safety device restored power almost immediately, however. Although only a small number of the fire balloons reached North America, Japanese propaganda reported great fires in the United States and an American public in panic, with several thousand casualties. In reality, the balloons caused little actual damage, but did have a psychological effect on the American populace. The U.S. Office of Censorship tried to suppress knowledge of the balloons, and the press at the time largely cooperated by refraining to publish stories about the balloon bomb incidents. This changed, however, when a fire balloon ended in a lethal explosion in Oregon.
In May of 1945, a minister, his wife, and 5 children from their parish were out on an outing near a town called Lakeview, Oregon. The minister was parking the car, he let his wife out and the children. They went into the forest. He heard her exclaim, "Look what we've found." And seconds later, the only known deaths in the continental United States caused by the time he got up there, his wife, who was pregnant at the time and only 26 years old, and these 5 children were dead.
This is quite something to see a tweet from the Canadian Prime Minister saying that he ordered this object to be taken down over Canadian skies. What more can you tell us?
Yeah, it also speaks, in fact, to the seriousness of what's happened here and the chain of command. And I will note that in his tweet, the Prime Minister also indicated, of course, this is close coordination with the White House and with President Joe Biden.
The press blackout on the balloons was lifted after this incident in order to finally spread public awareness about the fire balloon attacks. These 6 fatalities were the only known deaths caused by the fire balloons and the only known deaths in the continental United States as a result of an enemy assault during World War II. A monument to Elsie Mitchell and the children was later built at the spot of the explosion in what is now the Mitchell Recreation Area in Lake County, Oregon.
In 1936, Dr. Ishii moves to a huge 150-building compound called Pingfan, 30 kilometers outside of Harbin. It has an airfield, a railway line, and an explosives testing ground. To the general public, it is, ironically as it turns out, known as Pingfan's Anti-Epidemic Water Purification Bureau. But in reality, it is the place where Kwantung Army Unit 731 and hundreds of Chinese and Manchurian slave laborers and Japanese doctors and soldiers work on the development of biological weapons. Japan put a lot of effort into their biological and chemical warfare research already in the 1930s. The Japanese Kwantung Army, a relatively autonomous army group, sets up a covert biological warfare research center in 1932. It is located in occupied Manchuria and led and founded by Dr. Shiro Ishii in Kwantung Army Unit 100. Research is done into combat conditions and diseases using local populations in experiments, exposing them to sub-zero temperatures, to wounds, and to cholera. Comfort women are infected with venereal diseases. Gas and biological agents are tested on hundreds of civilians who are sometimes dissected or even vivisected. The test subjects are Chinese or Manchurian civilians who the Japanese see as ethnically inferior and for whose lives they show active contempt.
So this is 3 aircraft shot down this weekend, or this past weekend. Do we have no idea whether this is a pattern or whether these are connected?
Well, I think obviously there is some sort of pattern in there. The fact that we are seeing this in a significant degree over the past week is a cause for interest and close attention, which is exactly what we're doing. We've deployed significant resources here to be able to recover the object, as well as diplomatic and international engagements going on to find more information and to get solutions on this.
Dr. Ishii is particularly interested in the idea of creating epidemics and pandemics, which will spread without much further intervention once launched. In one of his inventions, millions of plague-infected oriental rat fleas are dropped from low-flying planes. They are released on bundles of grain, hoping to attract rats. The rats would help the fleas spread to inhabited areas, setting off a plague epidemic. This method is tested on Chinese and Manchurian POWs in the Pingfan Center. Under Unit 731, though, another covert location called Unit 516 is used for research into chemical weapons. Dr. Ishii has strong support in the government and army. General Umezu, Army Chief of Staff later in the war, Minister of Health and Welfare Dr. Koizumo, General Araki, and even Prime Minister Hideki Tojo are supporters of Ishii and his ideas. In July 1940, General Umezu orders 5 kilos of plague fleas to be shipped to Unit 1644, as well as 70 kilos of typhoid pathogen cultures and 50 kilos of cholera cultures. I have already covered in several War Against Humanity episodes how these fleas are actually deployed, first in October 1940 in Guizhou and Ningbo. An American minister in Ningbo says, as this lone plane circled slowly over the heart of the city, a plume of what appeared to be dense smoke billowed out behind the fuselage. I thought it must be on fire, but the cloud dispersed downward quickly like rain from a thunderhead on a summer day, and the plane flew away. Those are the fleas. More attacks follow in late 1940 and 1941. I have covered the multitudes of probable victims of these attacks. We're talking about at least 270,000 Chinese civilian victims, probably more, because there is no viable way to trace the source of all the deaths of disease during the time. In 1942, farmers are killed by anthrax and glanders. Plague and cholera rage like wildfire through local villages. However, about 10,000 Japanese soldiers also contract cholera, and 2,000 of them die. Dr. Ishii is put on leave, and Dr. Masai Kitano takes over. Under him, Unit 732 works on plans to launch biological attacks on the Americans with plague or anthrax-carrying balloons. Ultimately, all plans to attack U.S. forces with such methods were halted by Tojo in fear of retaliation. In fact, the records show that Japanese forces were allowed to use chemical warfare when, but only when, their enemies do not have the capacity to retaliate in kind. Dr. Ishii returns to Unit 731 near the end of the war to clean up the facilities and to destroy all evidence. Facilities are razed, burned to the ground, supplies are destroyed and disposed of. Hundreds of thousands of chemical weapons are hidden, buried, or dumped in the New River. The remaining test subjects, laborers, and prisoners are killed.
And how do you plan to work with Yukon's premier and Indigenous leaders to keep Canadian sovereignty safe, and what does that mean?
Well, obviously, the responsibility of the federal government and the armed forces is to make sure, and NORAD is to make sure Canadian sovereignty is protected and maintained. But we do that in partnership. You can't talk about protection and sovereignty in the North without talking about and talking with the people who've lived here for millennia. And that's always been at the core of how we need to operate in the North, how we need to work in partnership with the local communities and local leadership. I have to say that the Premier has been an outstanding partner as we've shared what information we have and keep them apprised, but also leaning in on the chiefs of the territories affected so that they can keep their people safe as well. As is always the case, it'll be about the partnerships and the close collaboration across different orders of government and different sectors that makes things work well in this area.
Instead, we will launch an open and transparent competition to replace the CF-18s, keeping in mind the primary mission of our fighter aircraft is the defense of North America. This process
There were only 2 cases of the fire balloons actually killing people, both of which were in the United States. And fascinatingly enough, these fire balloons are still being discovered today. They weren't tremendously successful. It was one of a number of efforts that people were using to wage war. But we didn't know that they weren't going to be successful. So of course what Canada had to do was to defend itself against this. And this is where the Hawker Hurricane came in, to active defense in Canada. Posted out on the west coast and then further inland, Hawker Hurricanes were there specifically to be on the lookout for these Japanese fire balloons and to bring them down.
The RTAF established that these balloons were approaching the west coast of North America at a very high altitude, between 25 and 35,000 feet. An attempt was made to shoot as many of these down as they could possibly do. There were balloons shot down by the base at Patricia Bay and Lethbridge and at Moose Jaw as well.
Defensive measures by all services are in operation to meet this menace.
So you have to think that in the massive forests of the Pacific Northwest, Canada, Washington, Oregon, there are some balloons out there.
If you're hiking in the Northwest, be a little careful. And if you see an element like a wheel with teeth on it, that's the sharp end of a disaster awaiting you, because it can explode.
The Japanese fire balloons were a balloon envelope of about 20 feet in diameter with shroud lines that supported a chandelier-like device that carried a battery and barometric equipment, a dozen 5-kilogram incendiary bombs. There was also a 15-kilogram high-explosive bomb mounted from the center of this chandelier device.
This contact causes the ballasting plugs to blow, dropping the sandbags suspended between the two plugs in number 1 position. Again, the balloon goes back up to operating altitude.
They develop a technology that is absolutely brilliant. Simple in its approach, but the technical ability of this bomb to be able to float to America and on its way be controlled by a series of sandbags that gets it to its target is incredible.
Someone had to sit down and run the numbers to come up with exactly how many sandbags, exactly how far they could project the balloon to move.